and welcome to Social Cognition. And in this installment, I believe it's number 9, we will talk about morality and prosociality. And so, in a way, this lecture will be a little bit different than what we've done before, where we don't only focus on one topic, but I've taken 2 topics together, morality and prosociality. And what we're going to do is we will look at these 2 topics in 2 lectures. And in one of them, we will focus more on the empirical side of things, like how is research done about these topics at the moment. And this is what we will do in this session. And then the next round, we will take a look at some theoretical perspectives on these matters. So what are important theories that surround morality and prosociality? So this is the overview of what we're going to do. And if we talk about empirical paradigms, then basically what's guiding us is the question, is it the truth, the thing that we're measuring when we do research about prosociality and about morality, which we will define in a second? What guides us in this lecture session is the question whether the measures we use are actually good measures, and if they really measure something, maybe not the truth, but a good approximation of it, of how moral and how pro-social people are. So I want to ask you to keep this guiding question in mind. This is sort of what the motto basically of this lecture will be about. How do we measure morality and prosociality, and is it a good way? But before we can talk about what we measure, first of all, we have to do some definitions, right? So what even is prosociality and what is morality? Let's start with prosociality. I've brought here some examples for prosociality. So behaviors like donating goods, food, money to others, helping someone out when they're in a tough situation, charity work, and also sharing resources that you have with other people. And even things like when you're driving, you're stuck in the traffic jam on the highway, then to move to the sides so that an emergency vehicle can pass through. That would be also an example of pro-social behavior, doing something so that others' outcomes are improved. So doing, and perhaps even at a cost to yourself, doing something that is good for other people. Now, why is this interesting behavior? Well, you could wonder why people even do this, right? If it costs me something to do something good for you, why would I even do that? And if we take a look at some kind of like a history of human behavior as seen through the perspective from expected utility theory, we could say we would actually be startled, right? And say, well, people shouldn't behave like that. Expected utility theory as a theory of human behavior and human decision making posits that actors behave as if they maximized expected utility over possible outcomes. So that means people do, this theory at least would expect that people do what's best for them. And what gets them the most out of a situation. And that, of course, speaks actually contrary to sharing with others, helping others, making donations, because that doesn't maximize your own monetary outcomes, right? You give some stuff to other people. And one example where we can see kind of this dilemma in action, or this issue in action, is the prisoner's dilemma. And I want to introduce that to you here. We will keep talking about this situation throughout this lecture, and we'll add a couple of different games as well. But so what am I talking about when I mean games? It means often when we study prosociality or even moral decision making, we resort to studying behavior in situations that are kind of constructed so that they posit a specific social dilemma. And here is one of these situations, an economic game called the prisoner's dilemma. What you can see in the little schematic overview of it is that we have 2 players involved in this game, player A and player B. And each of these players has 2 options for how to behave. We could call them option A and B, but just to make it more poignant for you, let's give them an actual descriptive name and call them, they have the option to cooperate or to defect. Now, what do I mean by that? what you see, the numbers that you see, are the outcomes for each of the players depending on the option that they choose and that the other person chooses. So if I'm player A and I choose the option cooperate, and player B also chooses the option cooperate, then both of us will get an outcome of 5. Now, 5 could be money, 5 euros. 5 could be, as in the original idea of the prisoner's dilemma, 5 years in prison for a specific deed. If I, as player A, choose cooperate and player B chooses defect, well, that's bad for me because I go home with only 1 euro and player B gets 10 euros. Or if we are talking about years in prison, then maybe my sentence gets reduced only by 1 year and theirs by 10. So I have to spend much more time in prison. That would be bad for me, but very attractive for them, right? Okay, but player B faces the same challenge. They also have the option to cooperate. And then if I, as player A, also cooperate, we both get 5. We already established that. And if player B cooperates and I defect as player A, then they get 1 euro or 1 year of the sentence, and I get 10 euros. So this would be pretty attractive for me, right? Okay, but the last option that we haven't discussed so far is that both of us, me, player A, and player B, we both choose to defect. And in this case, we both go home with 2 euros, which isn't optimal. But it's better than having only 1 euro. So where I cooperate and the other player defects, or the other way around, one of us only has 1 euro, right? And we want to avoid that. That seems like the worst outcome. And so the option where we both defect, the 2 euro option, is actually the one that would be predicted by theory. Because we are both players kind of scared of getting the sucky outcome of only 1 euro. And so we both defect so that the other can't take advantage of us, even though it would clearly be better for both of us if we both cooperated, right? Because then we could both get 5. But in cooperating, you make yourself vulnerable to being exploited by the other player. So if we think this game through, theoretically we would expect that many people actually play this defect option. So many people settle for relatively low outcome just to avoid being exploited by the other player in case they make themselves vulnerable by choosing the cooperate option. So while this is the theoretical perspective, we can take a look at behavior. So what do people actually do in this game? And there are many examples of this game being played in research. And the takeaway from it is that people don't do this all the time, right? They don't play the option where both of them defect. That also happens, but nowhere near as much as we would expect, right? So instead, people cooperate. Instead, people trust each other, and they're like, okay, I'm gonna put myself out there and play the cooperate option, and if you do too, then it's good for both of us. Now, we could ask ourselves, why is that even the case? So why do people trust others sometimes, or why, and this is more to the question that we are trying to ask, why do people share stuff with others? Why do people share their resources, sometimes even with perfect strangers? And here, the idea that helps us reconcile this behavior, where we don't see what we would expect from theory, is the following nifty little trick. So this nifty little trick is that we can integrate something like value assigned to other people's outcomes to people's own utility function. What do I mean by that? So the idea is that I don't only care about my own outcomes, how much money I get, how much time off my prison sentence I get, but I also care about your outcomes. So I also care about whether you, because of my decision, also get a fair amount of money. And I also care about whether you will be stuck in prison for a long time. So there are a bunch of different theories that try to formally capture how exactly prosociality is kind of part of our decision process. But if we can take a look here at a very simple one, and this is the equation that I've printed there for you. The idea that my utility, me as a decision maker, so how good a situation or a choice is able to increase my welfare, make me feel good, whatever, give me like good outcomes, depends on the weight that I assign to my own, so W own, my own outcomes, and the weight that I assign to another person's outcomes, the person that is also affected by my choice. Yeah. So that is the idea behind prosociality. So prosociality has to do with how much, the degree to which we care about others' outcomes when we make decisions. And now, what does this have to do with morality? You could say same, but different, but still same. So if we take a look at morality, you will find that even if we take a look at these economic theories that kind of talk about prosociality more, they will often talk about something like equitable outcomes or fairness considerations, and the idea that we should do things that are fair towards others and that leave others also well off, kind of being benevolent, you could say, is actually one of the staples of moral philosophy. So there are many theories that revolve around the question of how to help people. There's, for instance, a pretty old one, and a dilemma posed by Kant, who suggests the following situation. So there's a murderer on their way to murder a person that you know, and you know the location of that person, the murderer doesn't. And the murderer asks you about the location of their intended victim. Now, do you lie about it or keep it quiet to help the victim? So lying, of course, if you think about the categorical imperative, wouldn't be allowed because, if I lie to you, then everyone else would lie to everyone else as well, and we don't want that situation. But at the same time, you should also help the victim, right? You should not send a murderer towards and tell them, okay, the person you're looking for is hiding in that closet. Here the idea that actually helping is a moral value is put in a situation where it conflicts or it produces a dilemma with the idea that also honesty and truth-telling is a moral value. So you could say prosociality is kind of like a subcategory of moral behavior. And being prosocial is often considered a moral obligation, in particular when our competing selfish interests are small or absent. So if you've got nothing to lose, then it seems like it's often considered morally obligatory. You have to do it to be prosocial. And actually, there's some research that suggests that the degree to which people are willing to be prosocial, so how much they're willing to help, is actually predicted pretty well by their general attitudes towards morality than by specific preferences for equity and efficiency. So if I were to ask what is morality, basically I'm asking about what people think is wrong and what's right. And let's take a look at some specific questions where this might apply. So for instance, a moral question that sometimes we as a society are confronted with is the question of how to deal, for instance, with incest. So as long as it's voluntary, actually it has no negative consequences. But still, in most jurisdictions, there are specific types of incestuous relationships that are actually legally prohibited. While some legislations are actually a bit more lenient, so they prohibit something like first cousin and uncle niece and aunt nephew marriages. In most places, these are still illegal, regardless of the ages of the partners involved, regardless of whether there's any offspring planned. And you could say that if the conditions are right, then why is it even wrong to have these relationships? But still, there's something in many people that tells them that no, this is not okay to do. So often we would consider as an incestuous relationship as one that is morally wrong. Another example might be prostitution. So it might be considered a form of exploitation. For instance, in Sweden or Norway, it's illegal to purchase sexual services, but not to sell them. So here, if you want to work as a sex worker, you're like, you can sell what you have to offer, but the person who buys it, they actually commit a crime. But so these are some countries treat it like that. Other countries consider prostitution actually a legitimate occupation. So for instance, the Netherlands or Germany, where prostitution is actually just regulated like a regular, any other type of profession. Or there are even other countries where prostitution is just flat out considered a crime. For instance, in many Muslim countries, prostitutes would face severe sentences if they were caught. So my point being that, again, we could ask whether it's right for someone to work as a prostitute or it's wrong. And in both cases that I chose here as an example, both incest and prostitution, the question boils down to, is it right or wrong? So morality asks, is it right or wrong? But how can we know what is right or wrong? And here I have to sprinkle a little bit of theory in so that we can actually talk about morality in a bit more detail. And I'm going to restrict us by telling you a bit more theory to two specific types of schools that deal with with moral questions, and these kind of these philosophical traditions or schools give us answers to the question, in a specific situation, how do you know what the right thing is to do? So one kind of direction that we could consider for advice on how to choose what's right to do and what's wrong is deontology. What is this about? The idea here is that this school of thought proposes that we judge morality based on rules. So, for instance, Kant's moral imperative would be an example of a deontological rule. We could also consider so-called sacred and protected values, and it often boils down to doing no harm. So this is like a fundamental moral rule: you may not hurt anyone else. And another one that often comes up is being honest. So this is the one perspective, asking yourself if there's a moral rule that you should know and that you should stick to. And the other perspective, and now of course I'm super simplifying here, so please, if you know more about moral philosophy, please don't kill me for this. But for the purpose of this class, this is enough to know. So we have on the one side deontology and on the other side utilitarianism. And the concept here is that morality is judged based on outcomes. So this is kind of the idea is that people weigh outcomes to achieve the greater good. And there you can see, of course, that this is clearly related to expected utility theory that we spoke about in the beginning. So you weight the options and see which one produces the greater good, welfare, happiness, whatever you want to call it. And you, yes. So the interesting question arises when we posit a situation in which we have to make a moral decision where these two schools of thought, deontology and utilitarianism, actually propose different outcomes or like would support different outcomes. So in a given situation, you can either get the same conclusion from both of these schools. So maybe it both helps the most people and it also follows a moral rule to hurt no one. Well, then the behavior in that situation is just great from both perspectives. But the more interesting case is when they produce different recommendations, so to say. And that is what we would call a moral dilemma. Okay, so now this is the groundwork for talking about measuring prosociality and morality. Now we know what we're talking about. Let's take a look at how we can measure these things. In particular, here is our overview, what I want to talk about today. So I want to talk about using self-reports to measure prosociality and morality. I want to talk about decision behavior, making people choose. And there I will present two different views. One of them making people choose in hypothetical situations, and one making them choose in incentivized situations. And then I'll talk a little bit about processes involved in decision making in prosociality and morality. And I'm super excited about this because this deals with my actual research. So this is probably my favorite lecture in social cognition.